You know that moment on live radio when the host clearly expected one kind of reaction, and instead the phone lines deliver something else entirely. That's basically what happened on Jeremy Vine and Daytime on 5 recently, and honestly, it's one of those segments that's more interesting for what it reveals about public opinion than for anything the panel actually said. Because the setup seemed fairly standard. Another round of royal commentary, another discussion touching on Harry and Meghan, the kind of segment that usually rolls along fairly predictably. And then the callers started coming in. And instead of the usual pile-on, a good number of them did something you don't see reflected in headlines nearly as often as you'd expect. They defended the Sussexes, pushed back on the panel, and basically said, "Can we stop doing this now?" Have a listen.
Big one. Who are you backing in the battle between Donald Trump and Harry and Meghan? 0207 862 22 is the number. Trump has said he won't deport Prince Harry from the US amid a legal battle to find out whether the Duke lied on his visa application. But that doesn't mean that Trump is going soft on the Sussexes. Here is what he said to the New York Post regarding that decision. Let's just have a look at what he said. He says, look, I will leave him alone. I'll leave him alone. He's got enough problems with his wife. She's terrible. I mean, there he is.
I agree.
That's his opinion. That's certainly yours. Then, while speaking at the opening ceremony of his Invictus Games tournament in Canada, Prince Harry made these comments, which some, I suspect many in the media, have taken as a jibe at Trump. Have a listen.
When there is no shortage of crises, no absence of uncertainty, no lack of weak moral character in the world, the values you embody, the way you carry yourselves, not only at the Invictus Games, but each and every day. Your courage, your resilience, your humanity illuminate a path forward for us all.
Ooh, weak moral character. Does that sound like Donald Trump to you, maybe? Do you think the president's criticism of Meghan is uncalled for? Or do you think it's pretty much on the money?
To me about Harry and Meghan is that they said at the beginning, we just want to live our lives in peace. We want to go and live in California and not be in the public eye. And then they release a Netflix documentary and a book and another documentary, and now she's got a cooking show. They really want to be in the public light. They are hypocrites.
Jonathan, can I just, it's some might say at home, I don't know, I'm going to wait for people to call, but I know a number of people in my family that have very strong views about this. And I say, hang on a second, how can Prince Harry criticise Trump or even tangentially criticise Trump for poor moral character when you write a book about your family, giving away all of those sacred secrets between you and your brother, for instance, and criticise, and cause perhaps emotional distress to the Queen, and sort of leave your duty? Is that moral character?
Well, I think that's a fair point about Prince Harry. But I've got to say on Meghan Markle, I mean, I literally could not care less. I do not understand why everybody gets so worked up about it. Look, I love the Queen.
So today on Royal Truth Desk, we're breaking down that entire exchange. What was actually said. What it tells us about the gap between media coverage and public sentiment, and why moments like this tend to get buried under louder, more clickable headlines. Stick around, because this one's got some genuinely interesting tension in it. And if you like content that actually pays attention to what real people are saying, instead of just what the panel wants to say, go ahead and subscribe now, because that's exactly what we do around here. Let's start with the setup, because context matters. Jeremy Vine's show, much like a lot of daytime talk radio and television, thrives on debate segments. A panel offers takes, callers phone in to agree, disagree or throw in their own angle, and the whole thing runs on that back-and-forth energy. Royal topics are a reliable staple of this format, because everyone has an opinion on the royal family, and Harry and Meghan specifically tend to generate more phone lines lighting up than almost anyone else in that world. So a segment touching on the Sussexes isn't unusual. What was unusual, at least based on how this particular one unfolded, was the direction a chunk of the callers took it. According to the breakdown, several British callers phoned in specifically to defend Harry and Meghan and challenge the panel's more critical framing. That's worth pausing on because the assumption baked into a lot of royal media coverage, especially UK tabloid coverage, is that public opinion, particularly in Britain, skews heavily critical of the Sussexes. And to be fair, there's plenty of coverage that supports that assumption. But segments like this are a useful reminder that the loudest coverage and the actual range of public opinion aren't always the same thing. A panel can set the tone of a segment, but callers phoning in live, unscripted, are offering something closer to an actual temperature check. And apparently, at least some of that temperature check pushed back hard against the framing being offered. One of the specific threads running through the discussion involved Donald Trump's past comments about Meghan Markle. Comments that have circulated fairly widely and tend to reignite discussion any time they resurface. Trump has, on more than one occasion, made pointed remarks about Meghan, and those comments tend to get looped back into royal commentary as a kind of shorthand, a talking point that gets recycled to fuel a broader "everyone's against her" narrative. It's worth noting that using a polarizing political figure's opinion of anyone as evidence of some broader consensus is a pretty shaky rhetorical move, regardless of who the political figure is or who they're commenting on. Trump has strong, often confrontational opinions about a huge range of public figures, using any one of those opinions as a stand-in for, see, even outside observers agree. Doesn't really hold up to scrutiny once you think about it for more than a few seconds. The discussion also apparently touched on the Royal Rota, the long-standing system through which a select group of UK media outlets get privileged, coordinated access to royal engagements and events. This is actually a genuinely useful thing to unpack, because it's one of the more concrete, structural pieces of context that often gets left out of surface-level royal coverage. Harry and Meghan's relationship with the Rota system has been a real point of friction. They've been notably critical of it, arguing it creates an overly cosy, access-dependent relationship between the palace and a small circle of tabloid outlets, one that can shape coverage in ways that aren't always in the subject's best interest. Critics of Harry and Meghan sometimes frame their pushback against the Rota as evidence of them being difficult or uncooperative with the press. But it's worth sitting with the structural question underneath that framing. A system where continued access depends on maintaining a certain relationship with the very people you're being covered by is not exactly a neutral arm's-length arrangement. That's a legitimate structural critique, regardless of how you feel about Harry and Meghan personally, and it's the kind of nuance that tends to get flattened into "they don't like the press" in a lot of quick-hit coverage. Then there's the broader sentiment that apparently came through from several callers, some version of "let them leave the royal family alone." This is a phrase that's become something of a recurring theme any time Sussex coverage picks up, and it's worth actually examining what's behind it rather than dismissing it as just fan sentiment. The core argument tends to go something like this. Harry and Meghan formally stepped back from royal duties years ago now. They're private citizens, at least in the sense that they no longer hold official royal roles. And yet the volume of ongoing coverage, dissecting their outfits, their friendships, their parenting choices, their business ventures, their every public appearance, remains disproportionate to almost anyone else who's stepped out of an official public role. Callers making that "leave them alone" argument aren't necessarily saying Harry and Meghan are above criticism entirely. They're raising a more specific question. At what point does ongoing scrutiny of two people who no longer hold official positions start to look less like accountability journalism and more like habit, or worse, a business model that depends on manufactured controversy to keep clicks coming? That's actually a pretty reasonable question to sit with, regardless of where you personally land on Harry and Meghan as people. Plenty of former public officials, retired royals in spirit, or people who've simply stepped back from public roles get a natural tapering off of coverage over time. The intensity of ongoing Sussex coverage years after their departure is at minimum an interesting anomaly worth examining on its own terms, separate from whatever opinion you hold about the choices that led to that departure in the first place. Now, it's worth being fair to the panel side of this too, because a debate segment isn't inherently biased just because it includes criticism. That's kind of the point of the format. Panels on shows like this are often deliberately structured to represent a range of views, sometimes including intentionally provocative or skeptical positions, specifically to generate the kind of live pushback that makes for compelling radio. It's entirely possible some of the criticism being pushed back against wasn't presented in bad faith at all. It may have simply been the kind of pointed devil's advocate framing that these formats rely on to keep the conversation moving. The interesting story here isn't necessarily the panel was wrong and the callers were right. It's that the format itself created a real-time public gauge of opinion, and that gauge came back more divided, and in places more sympathetic to the Sussexes than the surrounding coverage often assumes. And that's really the broader point worth taking away from a segment like this. Media coverage of Harry and Meghan, particularly in the UK, often operates on an assumed baseline. The idea that public opinion has fully and permanently soured, and that any coverage simply reflects that reality back at the audience. But live, unscripted call-in segments are one of the few formats where you get something closer to an actual sample of public sentiment, unfiltered by editorial framing or headline selection. And when that sample pushes back on the assumed narrative, defending the couple, challenging the panel, raising structural critiques about the Rota system, and asking plainly for the coverage to just ease off, that's worth noting as data, not dismissing as an outlier. None of this means public opinion on Harry and Meghan is uniformly positive. That would be just as much of an oversimplification in the other direction. Plenty of criticism of the couple is genuine, considered, and comes from people who aren't simply parroting tabloid talking points. But the existence of a real vocal contingent defending them live on air unscripted is a useful corrective to the flattened, everyone's turned on them narrative that a lot of coverage leans on without much actual evidence behind it. So what's the actual takeaway here? Mostly that public opinion is messier, more divided, and less predictable than the loudest headlines usually suggest. Which honestly describes most subjects the internet has strong feelings about, not just this one. A panel can set a tone. Callers can push back on that tone. And somewhere in between those two things is probably a more accurate picture of where people actually stand than either extreme offers on its own. So, did we settle the great "Does Britain still like Harry and Meghan" debate today? Absolutely not, and honestly, anyone claiming to have settled that question definitively in either direction is probably selling you something. What we did find is that the loudest version of a narrative isn't always the most accurate one, and that sometimes all it takes to notice that is a few unscripted phone calls a panel wasn't quite expecting. If you enjoyed us taking a step back and actually looking at what real people said instead of just repeating the panel's framing, that's the whole point of this channel. slowing down long enough to notice the parts of the story that get skipped over. So go ahead, like the video, subscribe to Royal Truth Desk and turn on notifications, because we've got plenty more of these breakdowns coming. Let us know in the comments. Were you surprised by the caller's response, or does it match what you've been seeing and hearing yourself? We'll see you in the next one.